Welcome to Mayday Workplace Mental Health webinar series number 2, which we called Survey Savvy, about choosing the right tool. And today we're going to hear from John Oudyk, who's the occupational hygienist for OCAL, who's been involved with the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire and its adaptation into the mental injury toolkit and into stress assess, and Dr. Peter Smith from the Institute for Work and Health, who's done some analysis on the COPSOC survey and on guarding minds. So although right now I'm actually going to ask Michael Roche, who's the CEO of OCAL, to just say some words of introduction. Michael?
Yeah, hi Val, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, okay, and thank you everyone, thanks Val. On behalf of OCAL, welcome to the second Mayday event for the month. I just want to start by giving a bit of context relating to workplace mental health in our organization. So organizationally, we are working from our board's draft strategic plan. We're still waiting for the system plan, but our board has mapped out some directions for us, and which includes 3 programs: occupational disease, occupational health issues, and workplace mental health. So we organizationally have prioritized workplace mental health for many years. A lot of the stress assess work began around 2012, with the meeting together of stakeholders and listening to their demands. And I believe there was more of a prevention focus as a result of 2018 legislative changes to WSIB and a continuing societal awareness by various campaigns around mental health. But clearly there's a significant system focus for workplace mental health. Just in the context, these early stakeholder requests and where our role was going to be organizationally, we approached workplace mental health concentrating on the primary prevention space as opposed to secondary and tertiary efforts. Often describe this relative to the hierarchy of controls, and our focus has not been on the tertiary personal protective equipment level, which would be more of an individual focus, but more focus on the broader organization at the prevention level. So, relating to our planning and the fiscal year 2021, and during our program operational plan for workplace mental health, we did various scans and relating to workplace mental health just to see what was out there. And clearly, looking at the various surveys, it was a main approach for OCAL in terms of putting surveys out there. And we note that stress assess does map to the CSA standards. The standards support it for the most part. People are using guarding minds for that. We also noted that there was significant concurrent development. Things. Respect to international standards 45003, and so as part of the committee, we're really keen on looking at an evidence-based approach to see what was working with surveys and were they meeting the needs that they were intended for. Interestingly, I had a conversation with a colleague, and they had been doing some post-assessment relating to organizations that had been trying to implement the standard, and they would go and they do the implementation, and they find that as it relates to they were able to get to a few of the 13, but often they had trouble getting through all of them. So as we were looking at surveys and we were looking at how people were approaching them, clearly the kind of work and presentation that we're going to be looking at today was very much in the minds of trying to go with continuous improvement as it relates to survey development. We also started for this fiscal year, we've started a partnership with an organization, healthywork.org. They have a framework where I think kind of maps into the direction that we're going. The educational aspect of working with people and other stakeholders about how work impacts our psychological and physical health, as well as social and financial costs to organizations, communities, and nations. Also want stakeholders to learn about the many solutions that are available to promote healthy work. So clearly a demonstration such as this and the media events that we have for this series, go about trying to assist in that endeavor. Another component part is assessing the workplace for unhealthy work stressors using online user-friendly tools available for both individuals and organizations. And that's very much in keeping with this particular event and an assessment of drilling down to the various tools and surveys that are available in the marketplace. And then we want to, having done this, equip workers and organizations with these various tools to promote healthy work and healthy organizations. And clearly this event, will help to do that. We also note that as it relates to just various positions around development for ISO 45003, if there's an opportunity for recommendations or just constant review of updating of standards, this type of analysis and evidence-based approach we find to be very beneficial. And lastly, another component was to inspire action from stakeholders to share the message about healthy work, implement organizational change, and participate collectively to promote healthy work. And that's exactly what we're hoping that this series of events for the month will go about attempting to cover off. So with that, I do want to note the efforts of both Valerie Wolf and especially to John Oudyk, who's been an incredible champion for our organizational efforts at OCAO, and acknowledge the support of Peter Smith from Institute for Work and Health. And it's interesting as we go into this presentation and we learn about their findings. It's one that I haven't had any pre-information on. It's very much hot off the press, and so with that, I'm actually really quite keen on getting a presentation of the results. So back to you, Val, and in terms of moving forward with Peter and John. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Michael. And a few other people have joined us, so we are going to get started with John's presentation. I just wanted to remind people to keep their mics muted. Most of them should have been muted on entry, and you should be able to see that. If you click on the participants list, you can see that your microphone should be off. It should be red beside your name, except for John, who we want to hear from soon. And I would also, it's great to see people's faces, but I think we're going to, or ask each of you to turn off your video while John is speaking, just so we can be sure we have the maximum bandwidth, particularly for people who join from the countryside, or else here is the case, households who have many users nowadays are sometimes straining the bandwidth in their on their own computers. So here's John.
Thank you, Val. Tony, if I can share my screen. Thank you. Okay, just a second. Here we go. Okay, thanks a lot for everyone here. And it's nice to see some faces I recognize and names I recognize. Also, we want to talk about choosing the right tool. And I think Michael scooped about half my slides in his introduction, but I'll go over it in a little bit more detail, I think. So why should we use a questionnaire to measure psychosocial factors in the workplace in the first place? So the issue of stress in the workplace has been around for quite a while. In Ontario, back in the 80s, the SVR survey of health and safety committees identified that stress was one of the top issues. Similarly, the steelworkers, after their conferences, have quizzed the locals on what their top issues is, and stress was always one of the top three. I think we've all heard about the $51 billion cost to the Canadian economy of mental illness. And Martin Shane in his grad student noted that $3 to $11 billion of that $51 billion could be prevented by changes in the workplace. In the workplace, so awareness of stress and its effects is a bit of an evolutionary thing. It takes stages, and the early stage is just reaction to legislated standards, often violence prevention, and regulatory compliance, or even trying to get away with less than the bare minimum. However, that eventually grows into an understanding that mental health impacts the workplace, and it would be beneficial for the workplace to recognize it. Usually at the awareness level, however, it's about stigma and it's about the individual. And gradually, the workplace become aware that this is something that they can evaluate and manage. And then it becomes more than just an individual thing. It looks at some of the policies and procedures and how they affect. And finally, organizations who see this as an opportunity for development are the last stage, where they don't see it as risk management, but more as optimization and innovation to make the organization more efficient. Now, I also want to kind of put it into a framework that we use, a primary, secondary, and tertiary at the source, along the path, and at the worker type framework. And originally, it starts with the individual. However, we try to expand that to see that the organization can also have a role in setting policies and procedures and that type of thing. But it really gets operationalized at the group level, at the team, the department, or the shift. And there are also dimensions that are specific to the economic sector that the workplace is in and society in general. Now, Martin Shane, a few years ago, wrote a book called Tracking the Perfect Legal Storm, where he charted the developments of legislative bodies giving more and more responsibility to the employer for the psychosocial health and safety in the workplace. And lately, he's also called for the standard to be recognized in legislation. Catherine Lapel has also done a lot of work on law, policy, and workplace mental health. And she has papers which chart the evolution of this recognition in law and some of the struggles that go along with it. In Ontario, we've recognized chronic stress as a work-related occupational disease since 2017, going retroactive back to 2014. And in Europe, they even recognize burnout syndrome as an occupational disease in 9 countries there. Although it's a bit of a mixture on how easy it is to get compensation. But in the EU, they have recognized the Organization of Work and Social Relationship as part of health and safety since the 80s. And in 1993, they enacted the first regulations to do workplace risk assessment to include psychosocial factors. These were more laid out in 1999. However, the approach was very generic, and while people paid lip service to it, most of it was largely ignored until about, this slide is getting old, probably 10 to 15 years ago, they started passing very specific regulations requiring the measurement of psychosocial hazards and requiring even quantitative demonstration of interventions. And in 2012, the labor inspectors in the EU had a blitz on enforcing psychosocial risk assessment in the workplace. Now, the UK also has been involved since the 2000 with workplace stress issues, and they created a tool called Management Standards Indicator Tool. And Peter Kelly and his colleagues were the ones who dreamed it up. One day when they went out for a beer after work, they sketched it out on a paper napkin, and they identified 7 key factors. And eventually they got it worked up into a system that was put online in 2008, which provided a spreadsheet to workplaces so they could put the results of their questionnaire and analyze them against some comparison data, either based on population or workplace comparisons. The tool has 7 dimensions: demand, control, support, relationships, role clarity, and workplace change. They published the psychometrics of the tool, and they did this using confirmatory factor analysis on the original 35-item factor scale, or item and 7-factor scale. And in Ireland, they've taken this survey and put it online, so you can create the survey for yourself and administer it in your workplace. And I'm not sure if it works here in Canada, but in Australia, they've recognized chronic stress as an occupational disease for years, and after manual handling, it accounts for 11% of workers' compensation claims in one of the provinces there, or states. I'm not sure what they call them. They've also created a tool, an online tool, which is called People at Work. And it's a survey. It also has a spreadsheet where you can administer the survey and enter the data, and it produces a report. Michael mentioned the Healthy Work campaign, and we've been talking to them for a couple of years now, and they have a campaign which has 4 goals: to educate, assess workplace stress, equip people to take action, and inspire action. And as part of the assess, there's a Healthy Work survey. Right now on their website, they're referring to our survey, the Stress Assess survey. However, they plan to use the NIOSH Quality of Work Life as their survey, and that will replace ours on theirs, so they can use US data to compare their results to. Recently, I went to a COPSOC International Network meeting in Chile, and we heard that there are legal requirements in countries like Argentina, Brazil, Peru, and Chile to do for employers to do psychosocial risk assessments. And in Chile, the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire is the one mandated for all workplaces to be used if they have any claims of mental health issues at work. In Canada, it's been a public discussion. We have the work from the Mental Health Commission of Canada. We have Mental Health First Aid Canada, Bell Let's Talk program. The Canadian Mental Health Association has done a lot of work. A lot of it is on the website of the CCUHS. And we have Occupational Health and Safety Management Standards, CSA Z1000, which lists the 6 hazards to be managed, and psychosocial hazards are recognized as one of those 6. And then we also, of course, have the standard, the Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace Standard, which began in 2013. And as Michael mentioned, ISO also has standards. This one, 45001, is the management standard. And in it, it identifies psychosocial factors as a hazard to be managed. And underneath that standard, there's the 45003 standard, which is Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace Guidelines. And right now it's at the preparatory stage. We were expecting a draft to be released for public comment. However, the pandemic, I think, probably has set that back. I haven't heard that it's available. The 2 people leading it, the co-conveners, are Stravula Lika, who represents the UK. The UK had a standard prior, and so did Canada. And Norma McCormick represents Canada and is a co-convener in this process. Now, workplaces have used surveys for other measurements, such as job satisfaction or employee engagement surveys, workplace culture or climate evaluations, violence and harassment surveys. Mental health, first aid awareness, stigma reduction has also been a program used. Social capital assessment is something that's more attuned to the situation in Europe, but it's also being talked about in the US. And then we have PTSD prevention programs such as First Responders First and Let's Talk. However, when we come to a workplace and they're asking about a questionnaire, we usually get asked two questions. And the first one is, does your survey measure the CSA 13 factors? And the second one, is our survey a validated survey? And so these are the 13 factors, and we'll talk about where they came from. First of all, the CSA standard mentions some of the key factors in its section A 3.2. It mentions job demands or job efforts, job control or influence, rewards, fairness, or which is often referred to as justice also, and support. And these come from a number of theories on workplace stress. And the job demand control model from Bob Karasek is probably one of the first ones. And later on, he added the aspect of support to the theory. And the demands and controls can be laid out in this grid, where as demands increase and control decreases, your likelihood of being in the high strain quadrant increases, and this quadrant is associated with psychological strain and physical illness. The effort reward imbalance model by Johannes Siegrist is another model where the idea is to balance effort and reward. And one of the factors within this model is also overcommitment. If there's an imbalance, that increases stress, and that balance is better for workers. Then there's also the organizational justice model. Marcus Elovainio. My daughter spent some time in Finland, but I still can't get the Finnish pronunciation right. Originally conceived as two dimensions, procedural and relational justice, it was expanded later to distributive, procedural, and interactional justice, and how they affect both at the job level engagement, but also engagement at the organizational level. And so the people who put together the 13 factors used a grounded theory approach, and they first looked at all this scientific-led literature. Martin Shane was a part of the group, so they also looked at the regulatory and case law. They had advisory committees representing workplace parties. They also consulted experts, and I was involved in one of those consultations. They gave us free food, so. Also, they talked to key stakeholders, and they did a national survey, and based on this, they came up with the 13 factors, and they launched a free online service called Guarding Minds at Work, where you can set up a survey and administer it in the workplace. And Guarding Minds at Work was sponsored with funds from Great West Life Center, from the Great West Life Assurance Company, and also the Center for Applied Research in Mental Health and Addiction at Simon Fraser University in BC. Now, because I was involved in one of their early workshops, I saw a very early version, and originally it had 12 factors, not 13, and they were listed as per how common they were in the literature. And the number one factor in the literature was usually workload. So manageable workload was the number one issue, and at the bottom of the list was job fit. After their consultations, things changed. Job fit became psychological job fit and moved up from 12 to number 5, and manageable workload became workload management. Notice the change in nuance there, and dropped from number 1 to number 9. Also in 2012, an extra factor was added, and that was physical safety as a result of the consultations of the CSA committee. And psychological job fit was changed to psychological competencies and requirements. However, at the CSA table, this did not go over well, and at the insistence of labor representatives there, instead of psychological competencies and requirements, it was changed to psychological demands. However, on the Guarding Minds at Work website, it still is psychological competencies and requirements, despite it being different than the standard. So how did the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire come to Canada? Well, it was there already. There were a number of researchers who had used scales of it in their research. However, as a tool for evaluating workplace circumstances, it started back in 2009 when OCAO put together subcommittees of worker reps in order to identify how we could improve the workplace. And one of the issues that arose was mental injuries. And this was about 10 years ago. And in February 2011, this group called the Mental Injury Tool Group, MIT, got together and had a workshop and looked at all the theories and filled out a number of surveys. We also talked to Salvador Moncada from Spain. He's part of ISTAS, which is the Spanish Labor Academic Collaboration. And based on his advice and our experience with the tools and the review, we decided to go with the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire. So we asked Todd Christensen for permission. And here you can see the two of them in their smiling faces. They were a great help to us. And we piloted the survey at 3 union conferences and also administered it to 21 bargaining locals. And based on that, we had a lot of adjustments and additions. And then we launched our own website and tools in October of 2012. So we were based on the COPSUC 2 short and then survey, and then we added some extra questions when COPSUC 3 came along in 2017. We also took some of the questions from the long version for symptoms. And then these are some of the things we added. So we used the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, and these are the scales that we use: work demands, work organization, relationships, values, employment factors, and offensive behaviors. And these were some of the things we added, expanding some of the ideas on work demands, precarity, employment factors, optional demographics, workplace culture and climate, health and safety issues, and the symptom and health question, and from the COPSUC, and also we added 2 offensive behaviors. So how did these map onto the 13 factors? This is how they map on. It's very confusing, and one of the reasons why is what led us to try to evaluate the factor structure of the 13 factors, because it was difficult to map them, and you can map them onto more than one. As an example, this is the 5 questions associated with workload management, and the scale is a Likert scale measuring whether you agree, strongly agree, not agree, and strongly disagree. With the COPSUC, however, we have work demand broken down into 2 questions on quantitative demands, 2 questions on work pace, and 3 questions on emotional demands. And the Likert scale is more the frequency / agreements. So there's a bit of a different approach. We actually did, Terry Zemensky and I, we administered the two surveys to a group of students in a labor studies course, and they filled out both questionnaires and got two reports, and they were asked to come up with recommendations based on the reports. So when they looked at the Guarding Minds at Work report, which is based on the 13 factors, the recommendations focused on relationships, social dimensions at the personal level, and it was very psychological in orientation. From the COPSUC MIT report, it focused on legal, health, and safety issues. It focused on the environment, worker management relationships, and was more organizational in focus. So it's very much, you know, the old adage, if all you have is a hammer, then all the problems look like nails. Well, depending on which questionnaire you pick up, will have a strong influence on the type of interventions that it leads you to think of when you're trying to address the results. So it's differing perspectives. If you're coming at this whole issue from a psychological approach, you're focusing on what's going on in the person's mind, and that's where the intervention is, and that's where we get interventions like online cognitive behavioral therapy. Whereas if you're looking at psychosocial factors, the focus is more on the interaction between the environment and the person. So how do we measure the validity of a questionnaire? Well, there's a number of different types of validity, and this is not an exhaustive list. People have been coming up with all kinds of types of validity, but the face validity is what a respondent would feel when they took the survey, whether you had covered the scope of the topic or not. Content validity is how the experts feel, whether it covers the topic. Criterion validity is if you can compare this to a gold standard, and with stress, it's difficult to find a gold standard. Convergent validity, discriminant validity are about how well it correlates with things that it should correlate with and doesn't correlate with things that it shouldn't correlate with. And construct validity is looking at whether the scales actually function the way this theory predicts, and that's usually done with exploratory or confirmatory factor analysis. So for face validity, our MIT group did this by looking at it themselves. Also, our pilot administrations brought numerous suggestions of items that they thought we had missed. And we also heard from the people filling it out that just filling it out was educational in itself. Now, the survey is anywhere from 15 minutes to 25 minutes long. However, it was whether or not you wanted a quick survey or whether you wanted to fully cover the topic, and we went with trying to fully cover the topic. When we have shortened the survey for some workplaces, they've often come back with questions wanting more information. Well, where did the bullying come from? Well, then we answer, well, if you would have did the long one, I could have answered that question. So often when people do the short one, they have questions which would have been answered by the long version. The content validity, well, we kind of piggybacked on the people who developed the COPSUC in Denmark. Also, there were partners such as Bernadette Stringer and Ted Haynes who had used the survey here in Canada and recommended it. Also on the website, there are a lot of psychometric details and a history of development, plus many people have used it. There's over 400 publications where COPSUC has been used. The theoretical framework is a bit dated. However, since then, it has also been shown to be consistent with the newer theories of stress, such as the job demands resources model. So in 2016, we did a survey using ECOS and a polling company, both in French and English. And we had 4,000 respondents online, which were weighted to the labor force survey. And based on that, we published this article, which showed a confirmatory factor analysis that the scales of the COPSUC were indeed present in the results that we collected from a representative population sample. Also, we combined with a number of other countries with the international network and published a paper simultaneously providing evidence for validation in a number of different languages, including Canadian English and Canadian French. So in 2019, we redid the survey, and under the same conditions with the same polling company. And so I'm going to look at some of the results of that survey. And what we're going to look at is the floor and ceiling effects. A scale should not have more than 15% of people endorsing the bottom or the floor of the scale, or the top or the ceiling of the scale. Percent missing, the rule of thumb that's often used is you should have no more than 2.5% of the respondents skipping the question. Cronbach's alpha is a measure of internal consistency, how well the items hang together. It's a weak indicator. It should be more than 0.7. And if you have only 2 items in the scale, which our survey has a lot of 2 items, you should be using the Spearman-Brown coefficients. And however, when I looked at that this morning, they were almost identical to the Cronbach alphas, so I'll just be reporting the Cronbach alphas here. And also looking at the individual questions to see how frequent each of the values on the scale was endorsed. Again, the rule of thumb is that no more than 40% of people responding should endorse a single value on the scale. And so here are the breakdown of the French and the English scores, mean scores, the Cronbach alphas. The ones highlighted are the ones that don't quite meet the standards that I had in the previous. So you can see, for instance, quantitative demands didn't quite make the 0.7 in English. However, in French, there was quite strong. The difference is quite striking, and I wondered whether there's a cultural reason for that. For some reason, if you ask an English-speaking person how busy they are, it's not as reliable as when you ask a French-speaking person in Canada. And also the question about job insecurity, 0.69, that's pretty close to 0.7, but just slightly under the line there. The other one that was fairly different between English and French was recognition, the English being a fair bit higher than the French one. For percentage missing, it's interesting to note that meaning of work and recognition were both above the 2.5% for both the French and English. Quality of leadership and social support from the supervisor in English. For floor effects too, it was identical. It was job insecurity both for French and English, which were above 15%. And for the ceiling effects also, they were identical items that exceeded the 15%. So it was interesting to see the same results almost in the French and English. So combined, here are the results along with the confidence limits around the Cronbach alphas. And looking at each item, what we're looking for here is any possible score that was endorsed more than 40%, and these have been highlighted. So we see one here, a couple in this one, and in the last slide, we see 4 more. So in total, 2 of the scales had an internal consistency that was below 0.7, and for quantitative demands, it was only in the English. Job insecurity was pretty close. The 2 scales that had more than 2.5% missing were meaning of work and recognition. There were no floor effects in the combined. 4 scales had ceiling effects. And of the 44 questions with 217 possible values, only 7 had endorsements above 40%. So guarding minds at work. This is a questionnaire that is the basis of the CSA standard, including the 13 factors. And so given the profile of the 13 factors and the fact that guarding minds at work is freely available and widely chosen as a survey to evaluate workplaces, we searched online for the psychometric properties, but we could not find them. Given some work we had done with the survey, in some workplaces we've done both guarding minds and stress assess, we thought it might be difficult to confirm that the survey scales uniquely measured the 13 factors. We did find one abstract online which confirmed our suspicions, where they did exploratory factor analysis and found a 4-factor structure instead of a 13-factor structure. And so, what we decided to do is to administer the survey using the same polling company, but just in Ontario and only in English. We did it online before people left the workplace because of COVID, so we just squeaked in. We had done a reliability sample too, however, that got messed up with the people starting to work at home instead of in the workplace. It was only in English. These are the results. You can see from the results that 2 scales, engagement and protection of physical safety, they were graded as being strengths, and 60% almost of respondents fit into the strengths, and 60% and almost 50% in the protection of physical safety, and that seems quite a lot for a 4-point scale. When we compared it to the 2016 Ipsos Reid results, there were differences. The only ones that weren't different were psychological support, growth and development, recognition and reward, and involvement and influence. And most of the other ones, the scale scores were less than the Ipsos Reid, except for engagement and physical safety. However, the ECOS one was taken in 2020, is Ontario only, and the Ipsos Reid was 4 years before and included all of Canada, so different populations. So here are the same results, the missing, the floor, the ceiling effects, and the Cronbach alphas for the guarding minds at work, 13 factors. You can see that engagement and physical safety, as we noticed before, had a bit of a ceiling effect in both of those. But other than that, the Cronbach alphas were all above 0.7. And the missing was all, and the floors were all below. Oops, I missed one. One was above 2.5 here, which I forgot to highlight. So when doing Cronbach alphas, as Peter will probably mention, it's not a very reliable way of measuring reliability. So as an experiment, I just took the first 5 questions in the guarding minds, which are all from different factors, and tested to see whether or not the Cronbach alpha was significant, and sure enough, it was above 0.7, just picking the first 5 questions. Now, when it comes to the item, individual item endorsements, you can see that there are quite a few questions where individual options were endorsed more than 40% of the time. So in summary, all scales had an internal consistency of greater than 0.7. None of the scales had, well, only one had more than 2.5 missing. There were no floor effects. 2 scales had ceiling effects, engagement and physical safety. And of the 65 questions with 260 possible values, 37 had endorsements above 40%, and 1 scale even had 2 values that exceeded 40%. Now I will turn it over to Peter for the rest of the story.